I've not noticed the heavens opening up and God disclosing God's self in fire and earthquakes. But I have heard God speak in whispers. That's why I go to my office on my sermon writing days. I close the door and I shut out the world and all the noises and all the clatter, all of the voices that are clamoring for my attention, and we all have plenty of them. As I begin in the midst of the quietness to listen for God. In all my years of preaching, I could probably count on one hand the number of times that God has spoken to me in the midst of all the noise and the clatter. God doesn't work that way for me, tearing open the heavens, making the mountains quake. God speaks to me in whispers. But you know what? Jesus once made the statement. It's recorded in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 10, verse 27, if you want to look it up. He said, what you see in the dark, tell it out in the light. And the things that you've heard whispered, proclaim them upon the housetops. In other words, listen. Quiet. Listen for God. God hasn't hidden his face. God hasn't hidden his face from Israel. The people had just so busied themselves with other things, listening to so many other voices, that their relationship with God had become malnourished. It wasn't God's fault. As Pogo, the comic strip character, was famous for saying, we've seen the enemy and he is us. Israel's enemy in their spiritual impoverishment was themselves. So also ours. There are those times in our lives when we find it more difficult to envision the sugar plums dancing, times when it seems the harshness of the world outweighs the reasons for hope. Some say 2020 will go down in history as one of those years where the challenges far outweigh the blessings. I sympathize with many who are facing challenges much greater than what I have had to face. But I would offer this Advent suggestion. Rather than expecting a melodramatic demonstration of God tearing open the heavens, use these quiet days when you're at home, quiet times, to listen for God to whisper. You'll hear a message of hope. Even in the midst of this pandemic, listen, be awake. You'll hear a message of reassurance. You'll hear a calm and a comforting word that will provide nourishment and peace. God's people are at work around the world and around the clock, using resources provided by God's generous gifts of science. And their brains are at work around the clock. Medicines are coming our way. There are vaccines coming our way. Scientists are at work. Be still and listen. God's at work. God is in our frontline workers. God is at work in our many nonprofit organizations that are reaching out to help meet the needs of people in the midst of a crisis. God's at work in our faith communities. Even though we're not able to meet together for Sunday morning worship, we're not prohibited from reaching out to each other. And we do that, making phone calls, reassuring each other in the midst of our fear and despair. God is at work. Are we listening? Are we aware? Are we awake? Are we calling on God? Friends, may this season of Advent be for each one of us a time of hope, a time of reflection, a time of soul searching, a time to do spiritual checkup. I pray that this season can truly become a time to listen and to wait for the still small voice of God to speak, to nourish, to feed. Let us affirm that in the deepest recesses of our being, we know that God's not playing hide and seek. We just need to be still and listen and wait.